his reign by sponsoring and collecting translations and adaptations of classical texts and educating himself and those around him in their contexts, thus overcoming, or at least convincing people he could overcome, the chaos in misgovernment that had marked the earlier stages of 100 years. Charles' father, Jean II, had inaugurated the gold franc in 1360. On his return from England following his capture of the disastrous 1356 Battle of Poitiers, in order to, as the edict establishing it said, quote, do something that may and should be for the praise and pleasure of God and for the profit and common good of all the people. And one scholar believes that this is the first time the phrase common good appears in the French royal edict. So this figure showing the king mounted and armed for war. These were called the francs à cheval, horseman francs. Slightly lighter than the previous flagship, but it was valued at exactly £1, one livre, an unusual alignment with the money of account that reappeared linguistically off and on until 2002. Its vocation was both to mark the end of a half-century of devaluations of monetary instability, and by being used to pay the incredible 3 million écus ransom the English had been promised to wipe the defeat from French accounts. The king on and by his money had regained his noble and royal capacity for military action. Following the double meaning of the word franc, he was both free, as opposed to captive, and French, as opposed to English. But the franc à cheval would have been a flash in the pan rather than important, had Charles not taken up and significantly altered his father's monetary policy. Sometime before Jean's return from England, Charles took Ohem, who was then a master of arts in Paris, into his entourage, and Ohem turned his mastery of Aristotelian philosophy to the problem of governance. This culminated with the translation of the works of Aristotle themselves for the use of Charles and his lay counselors. But it began rather earlier, with, or at least shortly after, the composition of his pioneering treatise, the Moneta, which we've already heard about. Influenced by that treatise, Charles continued his late father's monetary innovation, but with new iconography, which you'll see in figure 2. The new franc à pied, foot francs, struck from 1363, showed the king enthroned, armored, and bearing a sword, and also the hand of justice, emblazoned with the fleur de lis. And this is a technical point, but I think what this almost certainly is meant to represent is the king presiding over his long rights. It represented not just a France that was militarily strong and free, but one that through justice and diligent care for the Commonwealth would move beyond the catastrophes of the previous half century. Ceremonially handing over 200 of these coins to Ohem, Charles stood in implied contrast to his father, Tudor de late, he never actually did it, handing over 3 million of the old ones to England. Rather than redeeming France's past, he was glorifying its future, instituting a circular logic where money created by and through a monarch and his learned understanding of the republic and the ways it should be governed would in turn create further wisdom, further expertise, and further good governance. It's notable how this process physicalized abstract entities. Money was coined in gold, royal power and justice were represented iconically, and it was an entire a program, iconographic program, for example, of manuscript mills. Ohem's intellectual work was penned, and it was paid trouble effort. And both Aristotle's philosophy and the French language that Charles sought to enrich took the form of carefully curated manuscripts. And of course, the king himself, his own body, received in his hands and counted out a gate the gold tokens of his esteem. Money and coinage were acceptable in this moment. Good government created money by applying suitable technical, bureaucratic, and academic expertise, whether scholastic or humanist, or the two at once, as you see in the case of the court of Charles V, to coining metals. Money was the product of what would, by our period, come to be called, by the end of our period, come to be called the state. But of the state working for the common good, was conceived in an Aristotelian and even a Republican book. It was an instrument of display and indeed of propaganda, a status that drew it increasingly into the Renaissance project, already active in the court of Charles V, of reviving the glories of the ancient world. This general structure remained constant through a long French Renaissance to the beginning of the 17th century. There was, however, we'll look at this, an important transformation along the way. In the 14th and 15th centuries, money was closely attached to a specifically Christian ideal of community, governed by scripture, grace, and, at least to some extent, the church. From the early 16th century, though, that ideal was increasingly secularized, and money came to be seen as something that crossed over confessional communities in time and space, and was governed rather by historical and natural than by divine laws. So, in 1350, right, going back to that point, the French monarchy was in a crisis. Economic decline and the Black Death had ravaged society. Since Crécy, war with England had gone from a serious problem to an existential threat. And the Valois dynasty, which had come to the throne a generation earlier, was rapidly exhausting the reserves of stability and legitimacy of its Capetian predecessors. This left French finances in a perennial state of catastrophe. One possible resource for destitute kings was to ask the Estates General for grants of taxation, though the results of such appeals were often unsatisfactory. A more dependable, but even less popular expedient was to buy down the coinage, banning the circulation of current coins and requiring that they be restruck at a value that inflated or more rarely deflated the price of specie. The seigniorage, the taxation that would take off of this was not insubstantial. But there was a long tradition that saw currency manipulation of this kind not just as harmful, but as illegitimate and even shameful. To take a particularly dramatic example, when King Charles II of Navarre, a relative of the French kings, prepared in 1353 to murder one of his enemies, Charles d'Espagne, the Constable of France, he justified himself to a co-conspirator by claiming that, quote, the constable had disinherited him and held his heritage, and had said many bad things about him, such as calling him and his brothers a pionnier, who clips or otherwise damages a counterfeiter, and other villainous things. Exactly what that pionage was supposed to be is not specified. Perhaps Navarre was being accused of pointing light in his dependencies, or perhaps there was murmuring over the fact that Navarre's recent double wedding, alongside the future Charles V, had been paid for by a depreciation of the currency. Anyway, the insult was both deeply political and plausibly severe enough to justify being wiped out. So in a political culture where support of the currency was already being conflated with noble integrity, it's unsurprising the political crisis that followed Charles II's capture brought the issue to the forefront. And there's a meltdown in France, as you can imagine, after the king is captured. There's revolts. And of course, the big one, the Etienne Marcel revolt, and the accompanying States General of 1356. A cross-section of the French political class, including Navarre and much of the faculty of the University of Paris, worked to develop a theory of the body politic and its reform that would endure for 2.5 centuries, and that took the correct management of the currency, it was always called the fait de monnaie, as both a central policy and a microcosm or significant elements. So thus, after taxation, the second issue that Estates General considered was, quote, that the fait de monnaie and their government had greatly impoverished people, and that through the recoining and adulteration of the currency that have frequently been undertaken, a great part of the realm's bullion has been consumed and wasted. And it is to be feared that everything will soon be lost if the currency continues to be destroyed in this way. It was probably in this context that Wilhelm wrote the initial version of the State of Wilhelm explicitly based his account of money on Aristotle, scholastic Aristotle. He not only fleshed out the philosopher's brief survey, but adapted it significantly from medieval ideas in his own circumstances. Thus, he held that money was a commodity chosen to supplement the defects of direct barter of surplus and deficit. Though citing Deuteronomy, he located that exchange not among peoples rather than the households. With Aristotle, he noted that money is artificial and has no value of its own. But he was not much concerned that this might encourage unnatural and unbounded accumulation, which he got not only from Aristotle, but from other ones. Instead, in line with the economic ethics that had then spread from the mendicant orders to theologians in general, he turned his attention to the way that money, alongside the commerce it enabled, benefited the Christian community. It says, quote, "It can clearly be seen that the coinage is extremely useful, even necessary, to the good of the civil community and the utility of the Commonwealth." You'll see that phrase gets picked up and echoed in the Royal Edict, establishing the partnership at Russian. The money was made not only for but by the community. While the matter of money was gold or silver, it really fulfilled its purposes as coins, and those could not be made by private individuals. But money in the striking of its images should be made by one or several public persons, deputed for this by the community. Since, as we said above, money by its nature is created and invented for good. And by this logic, if it was the king who struck a coin, he did so by commission of the community. In no sense did he own the money he coined. More significantly, he could only strike it for the common benefit, not for his own. Since coinage was for the community, the king might take enough seigniorage to cover the cost of its manufacture and distribution, but no more. The bulk of Othem's treaties was actually devoted to enumerating the various ways the currency could be altered and manipulated for profit, and insisting that those expedients could only be used on rare occasions to clear public benefit and with common consent, which would presumptively come from the Estates General. But there were two distinct interrelated reasons why such behavior was illegitimate. First, since the king would be appropriating the property of the subjects for his own benefit, he was committing theft. Quote, "Thus, anything the prince does that harms the community is unjust and a tyrannical act." But more fundamentally, the fiscal manipulation of the currency was wrong because, like a supposed relative counterfeiting, and Othem remarked, it is the prince's duty to prosecute counterfeiters. But how could he be shameless enough to commit himself what in others he ought to punish with the most shameful death? Ciceronian turn of phrase. It was dishonest and a violation of the divine order of human affairs. So Othem notes, in the Book of Wisdom, it is said that God laid out all things by measure, weight, and number. And they're a favorite phrase in wisdom. But the mutation of the coinage only produces profit through fraud. Thus, whoever earns profit from these mutations offends God. A sound coinage, almost inalterable in its weight, alloy, and preferably iconography, was at once symbolic and significantly constitutive of a royal Christian republic, governed for the common good and in harmony with the divine plan. This remained the touchstone of French political culture for generations. If anything, the religious aspects of this view seem to have become more significant as conditions worsened after the reign of Charles V. This appears neatly at the conclusion of one of the major political statements of the early 15th century. The sermon Vivat Rex, preached by the theologian Jean Chasson to the court in 1405. After long developments on how the king's physical health and the king's political health should be supported, the king's schizophrenia, Chasson turned briefly to spiritual health. This depended on healing the papal schism here, and more generally on defending right doctrine. While those who taught wrong beliefs should be suppressed for the common good. And Chasson says of them, such men should in good faith be prosecuted as counterfeiters, who are enemies of the civil and temporal life, as those are of both temporal and spiritual. Their counterfeiting, sedition, and heresy serve not merely as metaphors for each other, but as allegories, precisely corresponding structures at different levels of what ought to be a harmonious whole. The best testimony to the vision, right, that's reflected in that quote is a very odd work, the Songe du Vieux Père of Philippe de Mézières, who was serially a knight, royal counselor, and hermit through the second half of the 14th century. That extensive allegory based on the parable of talents, for which Mézières used the archaic term bezants, signifying a gold coinage of proverbial stability. A group of divine virtues of this thing traveled through Europe with extensive stops at Avignon and ultimately in France, setting up their forges to assay the local currency and deciding whether to strike their own bezants and make available their own true moral alchemy. The second half of the work turned away from that particular allegory, became a mirror of princes addressed to Charles VI, this was before his psychotic reign. Under the more conventional allegories of the ship of state and the checkerboard, the Exchequer. And as Mézières made clear, that this allegory was not purely allegorical. The kings instructed, and he goes through like a passage for every square of the checker. Right? In the first square of the fourth quarter of the exchequer, there's a passage which I'm going to quote pretty much in its entirety. The king ought to strike the good besoms of the soul described in the gospel, and also the moral besoms inherent in good government of the ship of France. Now you should also have pure material besoms, that is, good money, struck in the realm of God. Everyone knows that according to the civil law, counterfeiters are condemned to be boiled to death. On the other hand, kings who have good money made are blessed by God, covered with the praise of their people. Just as the king's mouth should pronounce true and profitable words, so the royal coinage should have true alloy and good metal of gold and silver according to its weight and value. For the moral religion, according to truth and respect, the royal coinage represents the royal majesty. They often say the money is like the Lord. I've never seen a place. Noble and excellent realm of France should have a royal coinage, not one soiled and enslaved by a base alloy, to the detriment of subjects and foreign merchants. As a general rule, no kingdom where pure money circulates can be poor. In a scattershot quality, this effusion is an excellent index of the contemporary philosophy of life. The spiritual imperative of purity and truth, the ethical imperative of honesty and justice, the political imperative of common good, and the economic imperative of price stability are all equally reflected in the idea of money. The Christian ruler and the Christian community were obliged to follow a divine order that not only included but was allegorically constituted by sound money. Already by the reign of Charles V, the strong gold franc 1360s, Charles VI there, of the 1360s, not ensoiled or enslaved by a base alloy, was the emblem of a kingdom not just well-governed, but actively favored by God. So here's where we hit the airport. The period of acute crisis in the French monarchy that began towards the end of the 14th century with the madness of Charles VI, and seems not to have been especially propitious for the developments of philosophy of money. As John Day and Harry Miskman argued, it coincides with a period of monetary famine, when major declines in Europe's often precarious supply of bullion made finding or minting coins for public or private purposes increasingly difficult. But this was most acute probably in the decades around 1400 and again the decade of 1440, 1450. Subsequent acceleration in demographic and economic growth meant that in some ways these conditions extended into the 16th century. This might plausibly have contributed to a growing bullions. That's Miskman's argument. That's the view that the Springfield state is largely dependent on increased stones and precious metal. In the French case, that came to focus on the flow of ecclesiastical funds to Rome. Rome was sucking the bullion out of France. Thus, for example, as late as 1484, the Estates General of Tours asked King Charles VIII at this point to restrain the papacy, quote, lest the whole kingdom, already brought low and very poor, should be stripped and spoiled of what little cash remains after the previous purges. This suggests, at least, that monetary concern played a role both in the development of one notorious feature of early modern mercantilism, the bullions of Adam Smith famously announced, and in the configuration of anti-Romanism that in the 16th century fed both Protestantism and Catholicism. Anyway, right, through the 15th century, it's pretty clear that Ohem and the Moneda remained the dominant force in monetary thought, not just in France, but in fact throughout the world. The most influential restatement of this thought was probably a brief treatise went under the title De Potestate Utilitate Monetarum by the late 15th century Tübingen theologian Gabriel Biel, which circulated widely well into the 16th century. While Biel mainly summarized Ohem's arguments, along with adding in some bits of basic canon law, he did make at least two noteworthy additions. First, in keeping with the era of bullion famine, he took pains to justify devaluations on account of scarcity of materials, because which materials cannot be had at the price at which they were previously to be had. So if you have to pay, if gold gets scarce, you have to pay more for it. By definition, you have to devalue currency. This idea is Second, on the authority of Antoninus of Florence, I haven't been able to track down where Antoninus this is. He held that someone, quote, moving money from a place where it is priced at a lesser value to one where it is worth more does not sin, seemingly authorizing arbitrage on both time and valuation price. Such positive attitudes towards money markets were not rare in later legal theology. And though the school to which Biel referred does not, Antoninus and so on, does not seem to have been terribly influential in France, the most influential Parisian theologian of the turn of the 16th century, John Major, did have similarly liberal views towards money and money markets. So in his commentary on the sentences of Peter Long, it's a theology text, Major defended a very strong version of what was under the title Dame in Americans, whereby a lender legitimately charge interest, interesse. Not the same thing. Interesse is not the same thing as usury. They charge interest to cover losses incurred due to a lack of ready cash. For commercial loans, at least, this was the equivalent, he thinks, of a skilled tradesperson lending his tools. For, quote, money is the tool of the merchant in the art of his industry. In effect, Major understood money as capital. And in that capacity, at least, it was morally neutral. This outlook never became hegemonic among French Catholic theologians, as it did elsewhere. That's how long I think, for example. But some in the French world, notably the Louvain Jesuit Leonardus Lessius and the Parisian Minin Emmanuel Magnon, would develop it late into the 17th century. But Rohem's influence wasn't just on theologians. Desiderius Erasmus's Institutio Principiis Christiani, which appeared in print right around the same time as Biel's treatise was first written, detailed the prince's duties toward the coinage with a two-sentence summary of Rohem. Similar views influenced Thomas More's Utopia. And I think I'm probably going to have a section on Utopia because I don't think anybody else is going to cover it. That is pretty important. The French equivalent of Erasmus's Monarchie de France by Claude Seyssel, addressed to young François Premier, François I, as the Institutio was addressed to the future Charles V, the Emperor Charles V. Went in a different direction. Seyssel warned that aristocratic luxury, quote, makes money leave this kingdom in very great quantities, which is the worst wound one can inflict on it, given that money is its blood and nerve. While neighboring countries took effective steps against the evil that France failed. So you see here, right, that idea of these kind of protocol. But in a disclaimer that suggested that the fate of Monet might be becoming a more technical and specialized topic, Seyssel concluded, quote, nor do I want to discuss the specific means that would be needed to restrain the loss of cash from this kingdom, since it is not my job, although I could say something about it. So by the time of Francois I's accession, the cultural and intellectual climate was changing rapidly, a fact that would soon, in fact, become central to Francois's own propaganda. The Italian Renaissance, of course, had been making its way north for a generation. But in the second decade of the 16th century, humanism really became truly naturalized in France and had an immediate impact on French understanding. It wasn't an isolated development. Since Petrarch, humanists have been fascinated by the numismatic heritage of the Roman Empire. This influenced the coinage itself, notably with the introduction of portrait busts on the coinage by the Sforza Dukes of Milan in the 1470s, an innovation inherited by Louis XII when he conquered the Duchy of Milan and imported to France. Figure 3 shows the kind of culmination of this. You can see that is super awesome.
Yeah.
At just that time, as Erasmus and Seyssel were writing, more scholarly reflections on Roman points also began. In Rome, for example, Andrea Fluvio's 1517 Illustrium Imagines used coinage portraits, which he reproduced by woodcut, to scaffold an account of ancient Roman glory, which was directly in support of the papal movement. And 3 years before that, in Venice, the Frenchman Guillaume Boudet had published the first rather inadequate edition of his classic super erudite study of the ancient currencies, De Asse and Parisis. Boudet was and remained a close advisor to the new French king, Francois I. So his work had a political as well as a scholarly side. The De Asse was an incredible success. It was an instant classic. But it's notoriously difficult to know quite what to make of it. I say this in one of the footnotes here, right? The best account of the De Asse's role in French culture of the 16th century is in an article by French literature, Bowen, the title of which is Rabelais' Unreadable Books. The book is largely, Boudet was unconcerned to develop extensive arguments. His book is largely an immense collection of comments on classical texts, interspersed with calculations, and an endless number of rhetorical excursions. Certainly it made money in a technical sense for the first time a serious and indeed vital subject. Boudet's historicization of money was ambiguous. On the one hand, money became a constant, right, through which, by simple arithmetic, one could make all times and places commensurate. In that sense, this text could be, and in fact immediately was, reduced to conversion units. This ancient currency equals exactly this much in current functions. Which at once opened up the historical perspective, but it flattens the historical difference of currencies. But Boudet was more subtle. He did make real efforts to relativize ancient money, notably in an argument which actually only appeared in the French summary of De Asse that he wrote, which was published in 1522, quote, that gold and silver were much more abundant anciently than now. For some is always lost by wear, gilding, shipwrecks, buried treasures, and so on, while the mines are lost and played out. You can see there's a history with the Bolivian famine, with the pervasive fear of Bolivia. But he historicizes this with very long, very heavy source. But importantly, he continued to no conclusions from that about changes in prices. He just says this as a difference. But that outlaw, right? That move could in turn much money into being a figure for the incomparable splendor of the ancients, as it already was for someone like Fulford. Boudet's anecdotal style encouraged that, and it became even more prevalent in his French summary. Right? And that seems to be what he thought French readers would be interested in. Correctly. A 1555 publication by one Charles Fontaine firmly thematized that tendency, pairing a cut-down summary of Boudet's summary with accounts of the New World's non-monetized economy, drawn from also from letters of Columbus, under the title of Les Nouvelles et Antiques Merveilles, New and Ancient Marvels. For Christian humanists, these expressions of wonder raise serious questions of moral exemplarity. Was ancient magnificence in the form of money with which it was now identified a virtue to be emulated or a vicious display of avarice? Somewhat counterintuitively, Boudet suggested the latter in a passage that was rather celebrated at the time, noting that Rome's splendor was simply perish. Truly, he says, this is the Latin, this didn't make it to the French. When I consider in my mind's eye everything brought together in this work, an image of the city of Rome appears to me, seeing it as a kind of strong box of brigands on a global scale. I can't really convey the vehemence of the Latin. That was very vehement. Money appeared here as an instrument and sign not just of magnificence and opulence, but of imperial aggression. That critique could, of course, easily be applied to modern Europeans themselves. And by 1588, Michel de Montaigne had done just that. His essay, De Coche, the third book of that's added in 1588. Continued Boudet's and Fontaine's reflections, contrasting Roman pomp and the glories of Mexico and Peru. For Montaigne, though, Roman luxury and conquest at least had redeeming qualities, he says. Even in these vanities, we discover how fertile those centuries were in a different spirit. Our spirit, it turns out, was one of amoral commercial avarice. And thus, the far more virtuous empires of the New World were liquidated in order to turn their precious metals into modern circulating currency and to further enrich the predatory European economy. Inherited by anti-imperialist critics through succeeding centuries, this account has continued to influence our understanding of what money means in global economy. World system theory. Another aspect of Boudet's project relates to a broader contemporary revolution of philosophy. So Boudet was trained as a jurist. The De Asse, in fact, developed directly out of a set of commentaries on the Parmenides and Justinians. That kind of turn from law to the technical institutional history of the ancient world was not just it was central to the then new humanist legal movement that goes under the name of the Mos Gallicus, the French school, because it flourished above all French, although disciplines were Italian, other major Italian, so it's common French. Its adherents applied its tools not just to ancient but to contemporary questions, including that of what money was and what we could do with it. The most influential, if not the most obvious student of this method was the reformer John Calvin, who had been a law student before embarking on his religious career and studied at the orders of some of the major Mos Gallicus teachers. And the fingerprints of the Mos Gallicus are easy to see in Calvin's teaching. His most famous text on the subject is a brief letter to a certain Claude de Sachon, about whom nothing else is known, written in 1545, but only published in a Latin translation in 1575. Published there under the title De Usuris, on usury. It's traditionally been read as a radical break with medieval Catholic doctrines on interest. It was. In fact, not coincidentally, it differed little in its practical import from the opinions of nature. That Calvin himself, or more likely some of his associates who've actually done the theology degree at Paris, would have come across in school. Like Major, Calvin equated monetary capital to concrete capital investments, in this case particularly land. He says, is money not the most fruitful in merchandise of any possessions one might name? Just like and the Calvinist consistory that oversaw the Geneva money market did so with an orientation towards charity, honest dealing, the promotion of the common good of the Christian community, while allowing commercial lending in a way that Catholic theologians might have envied. In a few ways, though, Calvin's legal humanist formation made some difference. There is, in fact, a difference, not in practice, but in theory, from the scholastics. So both in theory and in practice, he favored a legal regime of regulated licit interest rates, which even more liberal theologians were often with. It's pretty much universal practice. But he broke from Catholic tradition by partially disassembling scriptural combinations. Basing his argument to a large extent on the historical institutional claim, quote, that there is a difference in the political conjunction between modern Europe and ancient Israel, such that the latter, but not the former, was able to organize its economy without the use of interest. It wasn't quite clear why he thought that was the case, but he thought that there was a historical explanation. And so from that, one could conclude that the prohibition on usury was a ceremonial law, a particular law for the Jewish people. And did not apply outside of that context. While Calvin's example and practice were influential throughout the Protestant world, it's not clear what specific impact the De Usuris had. On the other hand, that cannot be said of a work inspired by some of the same theological and intellectual developments. The monumental treatise on contracts and usury of the Protestant, although not always Calvinist jurist, Chaldeau, published an extensive French summary, much more extensive in 1547, and in its fuller Latin version in 1555. It was frequently reprinted widely. It became a kind of instant answer. Far more extensively and explicitly, Dumoulin attacked, quote, the inexperience and ignorance of law of Catholic theologian and canonists. First, their ignorance of legal and political equity as far as civil law goes. Second, their ignorance or carelessness concerning the goal and ultimate intention of certain passages of Holy Scripture. Based on what in fact was a largely correct historical account of the regulation of interest rates in Roman law, he argued for the general legitimacy of interest, as long as it remained within the reasonable limits set by the legislature. While such views were certainly not uncommon, this was in fact the jurisprudence of France at the time. Dumoulin innovated in providing them with a comprehensive basis in history and in natural and civil law. He also dealt extensively with the question that, while technical, was of great interest to practicing jurists and of fundamental importance to theories of the nature of money. How to account for changes in the nominal value of coins when enforcing contracts. Medieval commentators, so if a contract says, I pay you a 10 écus, right? And I pay you 5% interest on that annually, but it's callable and it's puttable and I can pay the 10 écus and stop paying the interest at any time. 100 years later, do I have to give you 10 écus coins? Do I have to give you the amount of gold that would have been in 10 écus then? Or do I have to give you coins to the nominal face value, the value of the money account of 10 écus? So medieval commentators generally favored enforcing repayment in the same points or in the same mass of specie. But Dumoulin, here he was following contemporary jurisprudence. Again, this isn't an innovation, but it's something that hasn't been kind of abstractly justified. Argued that obligations should remain constant in the money account, despite the fact that in practice, right, that meant that it was likely to correspond to reduced obligations. The way that Dumoulin put it made the philosophical stakes of the matter clear. He says, the price and value imposed on every coin is its true intrinsic finance, insofar as it is money. For if one thinks of it as a mass of species, that is no longer to think of it as money. Probably the clearest statement to take that, the difference between money as commodity and money. Money on this view was an abstract and mathematical principle firmly distinguished from any material representation. There's also creation of the state, as he puts it, with public law, which individuals can never illicitly transgress, and against which their contracts and agreements are worthless. So among other things, he says even a contractual agreement to repay fully is unworthless. So in that sense, Dumoulin was developing Orem's theory of the doctrine, Orem's doctrine of the public nature of money. And in fact, he repeated many of the same arguments Mohammed made against devaluations, except in cases where work is your obvious public utility. So he doesn't, in a sense, he doesn't draw some practical conclusions, but he does so on a far more abstract plane. Nor did he do much to clarify what public authority meant in practice. Is it the same thing that Mohammed thought, where this has to be, for example, verified by the States General? The legal context, though, suggested a fairly free hand for the legislature. Thinking that but that was not a question that's going to be posed, right? But when it was taken up, it would be in a new context. For the 1550s, saw two developments that reshaped money. One was technical. Beginning in 1551, King Francis II reworked the bureaucratic structure of the French monetary system and introduced for the first time, although with limited success at this point, a fully mechanised currency. The first major technological innovation in coinage since its invention. The coins that he struck with the mechanical mint were the type you see in Figure 4, but that example was struck by hand. I've been able to find it. So the other difference was less technical. Following Henri II's death in 1559, in a particularly gruesome jousting accident, France rapidly spiraled into a devastating religious civil war that was so I talk about the bureaucratic and technical changes a lot in my book. I'm not going to go over them here. The Civil War, right, is traditionally, and I think correctly, held to have given rise to some of the most influential early modern reflections on the nature of governance that the traditional though the nature and control of money did not play quite a central role in these debates as they had done in the parallel crises of the 100 Years' War. Those issues continue to be prominent, both in theory and practice. So I'll finish up with just talking about the most prominent theory, the most prominent specimen theorists of that period on matters of political philosophy in general and philosophy of money. Jean Bodin, like Calvin Boudin and Moulin, was trained as a lawyer, and like Moulin, he made it his work. His interests, however, were very broad. Besides technical legal issues, he wrote on historiography, demonology, natural history, and those kinds of theory, and was involved in the French States General, and in fact, the Catholic Egypt. Thus, it's not entirely surprising that he got pulled into a debate occasioned by one of the major economic developments of the European system, the Great Inflation, that took off in the 1560s following the introduction of New World silver from the sea lines. In that decade of civil unrest, such an unwelcome development led to a flurry of speculation. And two of the most intriguing reflections on this, right, came from men at the fringes of the Paris money democracy. A Paris mint official named Jacques Colas, and a tax official and auditor in the Chambre des Comptes, Jean Cherouel de Malesherbes. First separately and then in collaboration by royal command, they attempted to apply new intellectual tools to the practical problems of money. Kind of a rerun, if you will, of what Mohammed had done a couple of centuries before. For Colas, that meant a somewhat haphazard application of Neoplatonic ideas that's roughly sought to replace the Aristotelian Florence tradition. For Malletron, it meant the construction of historical paradoxes. Right? But taken together, this set of interventions came to be recognized as the origin of a major tradition of monetary thought that, as a commentator said in the early 17th century, quote, has given birth in their infancy, adolescence, and maturity to almost all of those who've written since on the matter of money. Okay, so Malesherbes' Paradoxes sur le fait des monnaies were only published and have generally only been read as a pendant to Bell's reply. But they in fact set a stage, as wrong-headed as they turned out to be, for a deep practical engagement with the works and methods of Boudin and Moulin. So the first paradox, which is that they are wrong to complain about the dearness of things in France, given that nothing has gotten more expensive in the past 300 years, used a version of Boudin's historical method to construct a rough and ready prospectus of past values, and argue that inflation had only occurred in the money of a count non-specie. So the same amount of silver still bought the same amount of goods as it had, at least back to the 14th century. The second, quote, that there is much to be lost on a gold or silver coin, even if one passes at the same price one received it for, rejected Dumoulin's argument that the true intrinsic value of coins is value of money. Which he characterized slightly as saying that having £100 in interest for salary is all one to him, what gold or silver coins he has paid, or what price they're given, as long as he always has some of £100. See, that's the claim, right? Is that even nominal inflation is destructive, not least because it uses natural sense. Boudin's response in turn was effectively a corrective argument, right? That Malesherbes had not applied today's method. Working from a much more sophisticated understanding of the sources of French medieval history, with the techniques that he and others, from Jacques Pasquier, a bunch of others, had adapted from the classicism of Gallicus, Baudin showed that price levels in species had in fact risen considerably. He thence developed a fairly sophisticated account of the historical variation of prices, most famously extending Boudet's remarks about the abundance of gold and silver in the ancient world to account for species inflation through an influence due to the expansion of French trade and the discovered the New World, whereby, right, he articulated the ancient and modern in a way that somebody like Jean Fontaine had actually already suggested. He called that the quantitative. So yeah, so this is favored by as one of the first statements for quantitative theory. Value, and it's neither as complete or quite as early as the Salamanca school does it, but it's for real. But they also paid close attention to the effect of changes in supply and demand for individual goods. Arguing, for example, that Malethroit was wrong to draw conclusions from the steady price of damask silk, which in fact had become much more plentiful as its production had increased in Europe. Or in a long disquisition on the relative popularity of fish and meat. Baudin's work places quantitative theory of price in the context of a broader reflection on society, commerce, and modernity. So it is distinct from Salamanca. But also had a suggestion for tackling inflation beyond just accepting the commercial prosperity over higher price levels, which he did suggest. Although I should say that the suggestion he largely got from Coulomb. So he says if all gold coins were at 23 carats, all silver coins at 11 deniers 12 grains, that was 23.4. The rest of the coinage of pure copper, and gold and silver coins struck by machine. Then fraud and counterfeiting would largely cease, and the opportunity for the kind of nominal valuations and all. This technical and technological conceptualization of money was relatively new. It echoed the policies of the II. As I said, Colas, Mint, actually developed a fair amount of this, and it marked the path of the future. Though the project for mechanizing the gold coin is all there. Currently, the extinguished jurisdiction. Sheets they had, it's very expensive for gold. Starting in 1577, they applied to copper, where if you base the metal, you know, it can. This is the coin they struck.
We're getting close to 10:30.
Yeah, I'm done.
We want to have time to have questions.
And in fact, I can just stop there.
Yeah, good.
So, yeah.
You might want to see my 2005 article, which deals with the same issues as you raised in the Jewish context. Not everything that you raised, but the issue of repaying debts following debasement.
Yeah. It was, in fact, a classic problem in the civil law.
And let me just say something about terminology. I think when you say devaluation, you really mean debasement. Debasement, that is when the king, the monarch, replaces the current coinage with a coin that has perhaps lower weight or the same weight but a lower purity standard.
Usually in the Middle Ages, debasement was not uncommon, although it didn't happen all the time. Particularly by the time you got to the 16th century, it's devaluation. It's the same coin, same amount of money, higher price than the money.
Wait, so they're declaring that the exchange rate has changed?
Exactly. Right.
The way that today, fixed exchange rates.
They declare that the écu is no longer a 25 sol, it's 30 sol.
Oh, then you're 100% right.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah. Debasement is far too much longer.
I have a couple of questions for you. When Aram's work is really remarkable for his really very clear understanding of how the debasement evaluation affects the merchants.
Yeah.
And he's really, it's very important for him. How many, after him, people who follow him, are they also focusing on specifically what this does, what these problems do for commerce?
There is a long tradition of that. Yes, I mostly didn't talk about.
Okay, I'm just curious. I mean, if that really is important to the people who are writing, following.
Yeah. That particular tradition is stronger in Germany. There's parallel debates that go on in Germany that specifically around the effects on commerce. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people are writing in France, like in the 16th century officers. So they care about commerce, but mostly in terms of how that relates to tax revenue, and then they really care about stuff that affects tax revenue.
That's quite, you've done quite a lot of, I mean, this is quite a story here, so.
There's a lot.
It's really a lot. I would just, one thing about this, you had mentioned just as offhand, the first mention of common good in 1360 and stuff like that. It really, I found it back even in the 1280s and 1290s.
Yeah, Jim Collins has a book that just came out like a week ago on the subject.
I would really question that.
Yeah.
Sometimes they very often call it common prophet.
Yeah, I think he's making the specific claim that this is the move, the terminology of Commun to bien commun.
But bien commun, I mean, it's central to Olivier in the 1280s and 1290s. It's everywhere in the late 13th century and early 14th century.
Yeah, so I haven't.
Okay, hold off on that.
I haven't looked at those sources.
Okay, just hold off on that. That's all I was going to say. Okay.
And the king.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's, like I said, I don't know if that's true. I'm taking this from a secondary source.
Yeah, but maybe
exactly. What happens is, if I may, there's this very brilliant transformation, and Aram is part of it, where he begins in the Demonette in 1355, and he's talking about this, the common people. Money is public, money is common, but over the next 20 years, as he becomes more conservative and more connected to Charles and more believing in Charles, he defines Charles as the most public person.
Yeah.
And so it does the switch. It just switches the notion of the common good to the good of the king. The king is in charge now of the common good. This is no longer the police. But anyway.
The term that gets used in the royal edicts by the end of the 16th century is le bien de notre état.
Yeah.
The good of our royal estate.
Yes.
And then in the 17th century, it's switched to the other state. So it's one of the things that's going on. The more conservative state. That's a story that will be. And classically, that's 6 months ago.
There, I can't quite make it out on some of the earlier images, but it looks like all of the coins, the inscriptions are in Latin. That's the last one. Is that just a kind of example, or?
Yeah, and in fact, typically, and this goes down to the end of the old regime, the rule is that the inscriptions are in Latin on the gold and silver coinage and French on the small change. Now, so there's this classic, well, sort of semi-classic work by a couple of economists. Which makes the claim, first of all, that the main driver of the inflation of the money account was the expense of minting small change. So you keep on having to increase the mint price of gold and silver to cover the expense of minting small change. And the way to stop that ratchet was to coin copper, but if you just coin copper by hammer, it's super easily counterfeited. The Spanish, in fact, did this at the end of the 17th century, and the currency went a real collapse of their currency, that long crisis. But if you do it by machine, it's hard enough to counterfeit, expensive enough to counterfeit. So if you're willing to pay to do it by machine, it's not that rational. So Sargent and Bell think that that particular invention that Bell suggests in the 1577 was the solution to how to have a stable account currency. Not everybody's as convinced. I'm not entirely convinced by that.
I mean, maybe this is like a silly question, but how many people in a state like let's say in Spain in 17th century would have had the kind of capital in order to make a machine? How many private persons were there?
Oh yeah, I've actually I've tried to work that out. It's by the 17th century, and there's various things. First, building a machine that you can use to mass produce currency, that's pretty expensive. Those are finicky. One of the big problems with the machines that Henry II built was that they were framed out in wood, like printing presses or olive presses. You use that to spray gold, the wood shakes apart. That would guide that kind of thing. You want to make them work. So what they have wound up having to do is to cast the frames in iron, which is really big. That's really expensive. But you can make hammers. Just hand print, whereas those actually predate is mass production machines. So counterfeiters could use those. But yeah, by the time you're skilled enough to make one, to use one, to somehow create the dies that are going to be convincing looking, counterfeiting copper is not going to make it. Counterfeit gold and silver still will. But that's less of an issue. It gets a little bit more complicated because the Bellon, at least that Spanish copper currency, much of it wasn't hand struck, it was struck in a rolling press, which are cheap, high output, but very low quality. So that, I guess, used the term Spanish thought they think about. So there's all these technological issues that come up in the 16th century as people try to rework technology coin influence.
Were there kind of mirror or comparable issues in all the sovereign areas of Europe, or how does France relate to?
France was unique in trying to mechanize the. There was actually a bidding war between Henry II and Charles V over the machines they used in 1556. Elizabeth tried to steal the machinery at the end of the 16th century, but couldn't get it to work. And in fact, ultimately, what happened was that they mechanized the copper coinage they otherwise used to make the jeton. I mentioned somebody at one point. Metals. And then they fully mechanized the currency in the 1520s. And France is the first place to do that. After that, it's complicated.
Can I just, I don't know, we are short of time.
Probably one
Can I
more.
just pick up on the questions that we asked? Would you see a parallel development if you looked at the German case or looked at the English case in terms of the theoretical changes that you basically are talking about?
In England, not so much. I've actually
they have much steadier currency.
They have a steadier currency. They only have one mint.
Yeah.
They don't have the same kind of bureaucracy around it.
Right.
So yeah, there's much less of that. Germany, Rösner, who's written fairly extensively on that. There are some parallel debates there. As I said, they tend to be much more closely focused on working issues. Rösner suggests that the Saxony century. Coming edge. And there's some different developments. There's people there making the argument for the benefits of global inflation.
But when we get to Baudin, is anyone who rivals him in terms of his understanding of the situation?
The Salamanca theologians.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Who come at it from a completely different angle and come to very similar conclusions. But yeah, and I think it is important to say that Baudin, this isn't. He's traditionally, I think we have to wrap up with this. Traditionally, he is kind of portrayed as a solitary genius.
Yeah.
But in fact, the réponse is the result of collaboration back and forth among these. So it's much more of a collective work.
Thank you.